Close your eyes. Take a slow breath in. And let it go. Tonight, we are going somewhere far away. Not far in distance, but far in time. We are going to a place where the wind moves across open grasslands that no living person has ever seen. Where rivers run through canyons that have not yet been named. Where the stars above are the same stars you see tonight, but there is no one else awake to see them except for a small fire burning low on a hillside, and the quiet shape of a person sitting beside it, listening to the same darkness that surrounds you now. We are going to ancient Texas, not the Texas of highways and cities and the smell of barbecue smoke on a Saturday afternoon, not the Texas of the Alamo or the oil fields or the Friday night football games under bright stadium lights. We are going to the other Texas, the hidden Texas, the Texas that existed before anyone thought to give it a name. So let your body settle wherever you are resting. Let the weight of the day release from your shoulders, from your jaw, from your hands. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm. Because we have a long journey ahead of us tonight, and there is no hurry at all. The first thing you need to understand about ancient Texas is that it was not always Texas. Not just in the political sense, though that is true as well, but in the physical sense. The land itself has been many different things over the course of its long history. It has been ocean floor, it has been tropical swamp, it has been Arctic tundra at its edges, when the great glaciers of the last ice age pushed their cold breath further south than we might imagine. And it has been, for the last 15,000 years or so, home to human beings whose story we are only beginning to understand. But before we can understand the people, we need to understand the land they came to. Imagine Texas 15,000 years ago. The first thing you would notice, stepping into that ancient world, is the air. It is cooler than you expect. Not bitterly cold, not in the southern part of the state, but noticeably cooler than a modern Texas summer. The last great ice age is retreating, its grip slowly loosening, but the world has not yet warmed to what we know today. The air carries a freshness, a clarity that comes from a world with fewer people and fewer fires and no machinery at all. The second thing you would notice is the grass. The plains that stretch across much of the state are covered in tall grass, thick and waving in the wind, a sea of green and gold that seems to go on forever. And in that grass, movement, the movement of animals in numbers that would astonish anyone alive today. Bison. But not like the bison you might have seen in photographs or in a national park. These are larger, stockier. Their horns spread wider. They move in herds so vast that when they run, the sound of their hooves carries for miles, a low thunder that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. And among them, and around them, and watching from the shadows of the scattered woodlands, at the edges of the plains, other animals. Animals that no living person has ever seen alive. The Columbian mammoth, standing sometimes 13 feet at the shoulder, weighing up to 10 tons, its long curved tusks sweeping forward and upward in great arcs. It moves with a slow, deliberate dignity, its massive feet pressing deep into the soft soil. When it reaches a stream, it wades into its belly and drinks for long minutes, its trunk curling and uncurling in the water. The giant ground sloth, moving slowly through the woodland edges on its knuckled feet, reaching up with enormous hooked claws to pull down the high branches that nothing else can reach. It is not a graceful animal, but in its unhurried way it seems entirely at home in this ancient world, as though it has always been here and always will be. The American horse, smaller than its modern descendants, running in quick-footed herds across the open ground. The American camel, long-legged and swift, its neck extended as it lopes across the landscape. The saber-toothed cat, motionless in the shadow of a fallen tree, watching everything with amber eyes that have not yet learned to fear anything. This is the world that the first Texans entered. And they were not afraid of it. They had been living in worlds like this, or worlds not entirely unlike this, for as long as anyone can trace. They were capable, skilled, intelligent people who understood the landscapes they moved through in ways that would seem almost supernatural to us today. They knew the behavior of every animal around them. They knew which plants were edible and which were poison. They knew where the water was in every season, in good years and bad years alike. They were not lost in this wild world. They were at home in it. We know this because they left things behind, not many things. These were people who carried everything they owned, who built structures of wood and skin that returned to the earth within a generation of being abandoned. The permanent record they left is thin, stone tools primarily. The worked flint and chert that their hands shaped into cutting edges and spear points. Occasionally the bones of the animals they ate, cracked for their marrow and then discarded near the fires where the meat was cooked. But sometimes, in the right conditions, more. In the southern hill country of Texas, near a small town called Leakey, there is a shallow overhang of limestone that faces south toward the warm light. Nothing dramatic about it from the outside. Just a shelf of rock above a gentle slope, the kind of natural feature you might walk past 1,000 times without stopping. But this particular overhang, with its particular orientation, caught the attention of people arriving in Texas at least 12,000 years ago. They sheltered here. Again and again, across the generations, they came back to this overhang. They built their fires in the same place, season after season, year after year. They shaped their tools here, the small chips of flint from their work accumulating in the sediment of the floor. They left behind the bones of the animals they hunted, the seeds of the plants they gathered, the small artifacts of daily life that tell us, piece by piece, who they were. The place is called the Kincaid Shelter, and the evidence found within it stretches back 12,000 years. 12,000 years of people returning to this same place. The same view from the overhang entrance, the same quality of afternoon light on the limestone walls, the same sound of wind in the scrub oak below. 12,000 years ago, the pyramids of Egypt were a thought that had not yet been thought. The great rivers of Mesopotamia were flowing through a landscape that had not yet discovered agriculture. Most of what we call human civilization, the cities and the writing and the wheel and the plough, all of it lay in the future, undreamed of. And here, under this rock in the Texas Hill Country, someone was sitting by a fire. A real person, not a symbol, not an abstraction, not a representative of a cultural phase. A person, with a body that ached after a long day and warmed with pleasure near the fire. A person who was hungry or full, tired or alert, content or worried. A person who looked out from under this overhang at the same stars that are above you tonight and felt something when they looked at them. Something that we would recognize if we could feel it. Something human. We do not know their name. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they believed about the fire or the stars, or what happened after death. We do not know what they dreamed about, what they feared, what made them laugh. We only know that they were here, and that they were real, and that the tools they left behind were made with a skill and care that tells us, as clearly as anything could, that these were not simple people. They were not people groping in the dark. They had mastered their world in ways that we have barely begun to understand. The flint points found at Kincaid Shelter are works of subtle artistry, not flashy, not decorative, but precisely functional in a way that comes only from generations of accumulated knowledge and practice. The person who made these tools knew things about stone that most people alive today could not begin to reconstruct. Which direction to strike? How hard? Where on the core to apply pressure to produce a blade of a specific shape and thickness? How to remove material from both faces without shattering the piece? This knowledge was not written down. It lived in hands, in muscles, in the patient attention of a craftsperson who had been learning since childhood, watching more experienced hands and gradually developing the sensitivity and skill to do what those hands did, and it was passed on generation to generation for thousands of years through the same patient process of watching and practicing and gradually learning. Until, at some point, the chain was broken. The knowledge did not survive. And today, we have the tools, but not the knowledge of how to make them. We have the result, but not the process. We have the object, but not the mind that made it. That gap between the object and the mind is one of the defining silences of ancient Texas. A few hundred miles north and east of the Kincaid Shelter, in the rolling central Texas countryside near a town called Salado, there is a low bluff above a small creek. The creek is called Buttermilk Creek. It is not an impressive creek. In dry years it may barely flow at all. But it has been flowing, more or less, for a very long time. And on the bluff above it, people have been stopping to camp and work and rest for longer than the accepted story of human arrival in the Americas would have predicted. For decades, the standard account held that the first humans arrived in the Americas roughly 13,000 years ago. They came across a land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska, following the great herds south and east across an empty continent, and the earliest clear evidence of their presence was a style of tool-making called Clovis, named for a site in New Mexico where the tools were first identified. Clovis points are beautiful, long, leaf-shaped, with a distinctive groove running up from the base that allowed them to be hafted into a spear shaft with exceptional security. They have been found across North America, from coast to coast, dated consistently to around 13,000 years ago. For a long time, they were the beginning. Then archaeologists dug deeper at Buttermilk Creek. Beneath the layer of Clovis tools, they found more tools, different tools. Tools that did not conform to the Clovis tradition, that had their own character, their own logic. And the sediment surrounding these deeper tools yielded dates. Careful, rigorous dates obtained through multiple methods. 15,500 years. 2,500 years before the beginning. The discovery did not overturn everything. But it complicated the story considerably. If people were already in central Texas 15,500 years ago, then the simple model of a single migration across a Siberian land bridge into an empty continent was insufficient. Something else had happened, something more complex, more ancient, with more roots and more movements than the standard account allowed. Perhaps some people came by sea, moving south along the Pacific coastline in small watercraft, living on marine resources, leaving campsites that are now underwater beneath 100 feet of ocean that has risen since those journeys were made. Perhaps there were multiple migrations, waves of people arriving at different times from different directions. Perhaps the Americas were populated in a story far more intricate than we imagined. The research continues. Every year, new sites, new dates, new evidence emerges. The story keeps shifting. The beginning keeps moving back. And at the center of the debate, sitting quietly on a bluff above a small Texas creek, is Buttermilk Creek, holding its secrets, waiting for better questions. Further north, in the flat, dry country of the Texas Panhandle, the ancient landscape opens up into something vast and disorienting. The Llano Estacado. The Staked Plains, a high plateau that stretches from the New Mexico border east into the Texas Panhandle and south into central Texas, so flat and so featureless that the Spanish explorers who first crossed it in the 16th century described driving stakes into the ground to mark their path. Because without landmarks of any kind, they had no way of knowing which direction they had come from. On this plateau, at its southern edge, near the city of Lubbock, there is a dry lake bed. The Lubbock Lake Landmark. The lake that once occupied this depression is long gone, drained in the 20th century for agriculture. But when the water was here, and for thousands of years before the drainage, this was one of the most important places on the southern plains. A reliable water source in a landscape where water was not always reliable. A gathering place for animals, and therefore for the people who hunted them. The archaeological record at Lubbock Lake spans 12,000 years of continuous human presence. Every major cultural period of the southern plains is represented here, one above the other in the sediment, like the layers of a very long book. At the very bottom, the Clovis hunters, their distinctive points found alongside the bones of mammoths they had killed and butchered here at this water source. Above them, the Folsom people, who came after the Clovis and hunted a different, slightly smaller species of ancient bison. Above the Folsom, the various archaic cultures, people who had adapted to the post-Ice Age world and developed new ways of using the changed landscape. And above them, closer to the surface, the cultures of the late prehistoric period, and finally, the historic tribes. 12,000 years. Layer upon layer, life upon life. The Clovis hunters who came here left behind the bones of the mammoths they killed. The bones bear cut marks, the unambiguous signature of stone tools removing meat from bone. They cracked the long bones for marrow. They processed every edible part of the enormous animals they hunted, because nothing was wasted in a world where the next meal was never guaranteed. And those mammoths, those enormous, magnificent animals that had been part of the Texas landscape for millions of years before humans arrived, were running out of time. The question of what killed the great megafauna of the Americas, the mammoths and mastodons and giant sloths and ancient horses and the rest, is one of the enduring controversies of American prehistory. Human hunting, certainly, played a role. The arrival of skilled hunters in an ecosystem where the large animals had never learned to fear anything that walked on two legs was, almost certainly, a significant disruption. But climate change was also happening. The world was warming rapidly as the Ice Age ended. Ecosystems were shifting. The great grasslands that had supported the megafauna were changing. The animals were under pressure from multiple directions at once, whether it was the hunters or the climate, or both working together that tipped the mammoths into extinction, we cannot say with certainty. What we know is that they were here drinking at this lake in the Texas Panhandle, and then they were gone. And the people who had hunted them adapted. They always adapted. That is the story of ancient Texas, repeated across 15,000 years. The world changes, and the people change with it. New animals replace the old ones. New plants come to dominate the landscape. New challenges arise, and new strategies are developed to meet them. The capacity to adapt is the defining characteristic of the ancient Texans, not any single technology or way of life. But the underlying flexibility, the willingness to learn and change and try new things, that allowed them to survive every transformation the land threw at them. East of the Panhandle, east of the rolling central Texas hills, east of the Blackland prairies with their heavy dark soils, the land changes character entirely. The piney woods of East Texas announce themselves gradually. The scrubby cedar and live oak of the hill country give way to larger trees, then to the tall pine forests of the Piney Woods region, the westernmost extension of the great Eastern Forest that once covered most of eastern North America. The air becomes more humid. The creeks run slower and deeper. The soil changes from thin limestone to deep red clay, and in this transformed landscape, among the tall pines and the slow red rivers, a civilization arose. The Caddo. Not a single tribe, but a confederacy, a network, a family of related peoples sharing language and culture and religion across a territory that stretched from East Texas into Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. At the height of their influence, roughly between the years 800 and 1200 of the Common Era, the Caddo built something remarkable. Not remarkable in the way that Rome or Egypt was remarkable, with their stone monuments and their armies and their written records, but remarkable in a quieter, more intimate way. Remarkable in the way that a highly sophisticated, deeply sustainable, richly connected human civilization can be remarkable when it has had a long time to understand the landscape it inhabits. The Caddo farmed, not the tentative, supplemental farming of people still primarily dependent on hunting and gathering, but committed, serious, intensive agriculture. Their fields stretched out from their villages into the clearings they had cut from the forest over generations. They grew corn, beans, and squash together in the time-tested partnership that farmers across eastern North America had refined over centuries. The corn provided carbohydrates. The beans added protein and fixed nitrogen in the soil. The squash shaded the ground and kept moisture in. Together, these three crops produced more food per acre than almost any other agricultural system available without modern chemistry. The surplus this agriculture generated was the foundation of everything else the Caddo built. Their houses were extraordinary structures, circular, sometimes 40 or 50 feet in diameter, with walls of woven branches plastered with clay and roofs of thatched grass rising to a high-pointed dome. From the outside, a Caddo house looked like a great brown basket turned upside down, rising from the red clay soil of the East Texas forest. Inside, it was organized with care, sleeping platforms around the perimeter, a central fire, storage areas and work areas and social areas, all fitting together in the round space, with an efficiency that came from long experience. Multiple generations lived together in these houses, grandparents and parents and children, all sharing the circular space around the central fire, all contributing to the household economy, all participating in the collective life of the community. There was nothing primitive about these communities, nothing simple. The social organization required to coordinate the agriculture, the construction, the trade, the religious ceremonies, the political relationships between communities was sophisticated beyond easy description. The Caddo had leaders, priests, specialists of various kinds. They had systems for managing the distribution of surplus, for organizing collective labor, for maintaining the trade networks that connected them to the wider world. And those trade networks were astonishing in their reach. Among the objects found in Caddo burial sites, objects placed with the honored dead to accompany them into whatever came after, are things that should not have been thereby. Any simple accounting: copper, beaten thin and shaped into ornaments. The copper came from the Great Lakes region, 1,000 miles to the north. It traveled through multiple hands, through multiple exchanges, before arriving here in the red clay soil of East Texas. Shell ornaments carved from the shells of marine mollusks. The shells came from the Gulf of Mexico, hundreds of miles to the south. Others came from the Pacific coast, 2,000 miles to the west. Stones from the Rocky Mountains. Pottery styles reflecting influences from the great Mississippian cultures of the river valleys to the north and east. Ceremonial objects whose raw materials or design elements pointed in every direction of the compass, to peoples and places that most individual Caddo might never have visited or even heard of directly. These objects moved through chains of exchange, each link in the chain a relationship between two communities, each relationship maintained through the regular exchange of goods and gifts and visits. No single person carried copper from Lake Superior to East Texas. But many people together, each contributing their link in the chain, accomplished what no single person could have done alone. The Caddo were embedded in a continent-spanning web of human connection. They were participants in one of the most ambitious and most invisible collective projects in human history, the maintenance of a network of trade and communication across thousands of miles of landscape, entirely without writing, without wheeled vehicles, without any mechanical means of transport at all. Just human feet. And human memory. And human relationships tended carefully across generations. In a world that sometimes feels too connected, too networked, too entangled in the demands of distant strangers, there is something worth thinking about in the Caddo trade. Network. It was, by any measure, less efficient than our modern systems. Information moved slowly, goods moved slowly, misunderstandings were common and hard to correct. But it was also, in some ways, more humane. Every transaction was a relationship, every exchange was between people who knew each other or who were vouched for by people who knew them. The network was not abstract, it was personal, it was alive, and it lasted for centuries. The mounds of the Caddo are their most visible legacy. 3 of the best preserved stand near the small East Texas town of Alto, at the site now protected as Caddo Mounds State Historic Site. The largest is a ceremonial platform mound. From the flat ground of the surrounding forest, it rises perhaps 15 feet, its sides steep, its top broad and flat. Grass covers it now, giving it a gentle, rounded appearance that softens the human intention behind it. But look at the shape carefully, and the intention is clear. This mound was built by human hands. Basket by basket, load by load, generation by generation, people carried earth to this spot and added it to the growing structure. At its summit, in the centuries when the mound was in active use, there were temples, structures of wood and thatch, raised on the elevated platform to be visible from a distance, to be set apart from the ordinary space of the village below. Religious buildings, political buildings, the sacred spaces where the business of the spirit world was conducted by the specialists whose lives were devoted to that purpose. Those structures are gone. The wood rotted, the thatch blew away, the clay plaster crumbled back into the earth. Nothing visible remains of the buildings that once stood here. But the mound remains. A hill that was not here before people made it, a permanent alteration to the landscape, built with an intention so strong that it has lasted 700 years since the last Caddo ceremony was held at its summit. The second mound at the Caddo site is a burial mound. Within it, in carefully prepared pits, lie the remains of people who were important in the Caddo world, people whose status was high enough that their community invested considerable labor in their burial, people who were sent into the afterlife, whatever that meant in the Caddo understanding, with objects that spoke of wealth and connection and the relationships they had. Maintained in life. Standing at the base of this burial mound, knowing what lies within it, you feel something that is not exactly sadness and not exactly reverence, but something in between, a recognition of mortality that is also a recognition of the human insistence on meaning. These people are dead. They have been dead for 7 or 8 centuries. Whatever they thought and felt and hoped and feared is gone as completely as it is possible for anything to be gone. And yet the mound remains. The care with which they were buried remains. The fact that someone thought it mattered remains. That, perhaps, is what monuments are for. Not to preserve the dead who cannot be preserved, but to preserve the fact that the living cared. to leave a mark in the landscape that says, this person mattered. This life was significant. We took the time. We took the time. The third feature of the Caddoan site is the residential area, where the ordinary people of the community lived their ordinary lives. The archaeologists who have worked here for decades have built up a picture of daily life that is, by any measure, comfortable and well organized. The houses were warm and dry, the food was adequate and varied. The community had specialists who made beautiful pottery, who crafted tools, who maintained the religious and political systems that held the community together. Life was not easy by modern standards. There were no hospitals, no analgesics, no insurance against bad harvests. Childhood mortality was high. Life expectancy was shorter than we would consider acceptable today. But life was not brutal. It was not a desperate scramble for survival. It was organized, meaningful, connected. And then, around 1300 of the Common Era, the community at the Caddo Mounds site dispersed. The mounds were not maintained. The temples were not rebuilt when they fell. The residential area was abandoned. The red clay soil of East Texas, freed from the weight of human habitation, began the slow work of reclamation. The trees moved in. The forest, which the Caddo had been pushing back for 5 centuries, began its patient return. What happened? The evidence, read carefully, tells of climate change. The late 13th century was a period of prolonged drought across much of North America. The rains that had watered the Caddo fields for generations became unreliable. Harvests failed. Stored food ran out. The surplus that had supported the specialists and the mound building and the elaborate trade network shrank, and then disappeared. Without surplus, the elaborate social structure that depended on surplus could not be maintained. The Caddo did not disappear. Their descendants are alive today. The Caddo Nation of Oklahoma, a federally recognized tribe with its own government and its own cultural institutions, working to preserve and revitalize the language and traditions that survived centuries of disruption. But the specific community at this specific place, the people who built these specific mounds and maintained these specific temples, scattered, and the forest grew back over what they had left. Further south and west, in a landscape as different from the East Texas pinewoods as the imagination can stretch, another ancient mystery waits. The Trans-Pecos region. Far West Texas. A landscape of volcanic mountains and deep desert basins, a vast sky and distances that seem to exceed what a human eye can hold. The Rio Grande cuts its great curves through this country, and where it runs, there is water, and where there is water, there is life. But the dominant quality of this landscape is dryness, and within that dryness, a particular kind of clarity. The air is clear, the light is intense. The colors of the rock, red and orange and gray and ochre, are vivid in a way that softer landscapes never achieve. And the silence, especially at night, is a silence of extraordinary depth. People have been living in this severe and beautiful landscape for at least 10,000 years. The Chihuahuan Desert, which covers most of this region, was not always as dry as it is today. During wetter periods, the landscape supported more vegetation, more water, more animals. The ancient peoples of the Trans-Pecos moved through cycles of greater and lesser availability, adapting their strategies as the climate shifted over centuries. They were hunter-gatherers primarily. The landscape did not lend itself to the intensive agriculture that the Caddo practiced. But hunter-gatherer does not mean simple, and it does not mean impoverished. The ancient peoples of the Trans-Pecos knew their landscape with a depth and intimacy that would astonish a modern person. They knew every plant in the desert, its uses and its seasons and its locations. The lecugia, that sharp-leaved agave whose fiber could be twisted into rope, and whose heart could be roasted for food. The sotol, whose crowns provided sustenance, and whose leaves provided fiber. The prickly pear cactus, whose pads and fruits were food across every season. The mesquite, whose pods were ground into flour and whose wood burned hot. They knew the desert the way a library is known by a skilled librarian. Not just the existence of each book, but its location, its contents, its relationship to the other books around it, a living knowledge, constantly updated, constantly in use. And they made art. This is the thing that sets the Trans-Pecos peoples apart in the archaeological record of Texas. Not just the quality of their art, which is extraordinary, but the sheer quantity of it, and the diversity of it, and the seriousness with which it was made. The canyon walls of the lower Pecos, where the Pecos River joins the Rio Grande, are covered in paintings. Not in the way that a wall is covered in wallpaper, uniform and decorative. In the way that a library wall might be covered in books, each item its own complete statement, its own weight of meaning, its own relationship to the items around it. Some of the paintings are 4,000 years old. Some may be older. The most recent are 1,000 years old. And between those extremes, generation after generation of artists came to these protected limestone surfaces and added their visions to the accumulating record. The figures are not simple. There are animals rendered with a sensitivity to their specific character that comes from intimate, sustained observation. Deer with the particular alert quality that deer have. Panther with the specific dangerous stillness of a large predatory cat at rest. These are not symbolic animals, not generic fauna. These are specific animals, painted by people who had watched them with attention across many years. There are human figures, but often not quite human. Figures with elaborate headdresses, their arms raised in gestures that suggest ceremony or flight or transformation. Figures whose bodies blend into the bodies of animals, whose identities seem to shift between the human and the other. These are figures from the borderland between the ordinary world and whatever lies beyond it. And then the great shamanic figures. These are the images that stop the breath. Large, complex, painted in multiple colors, their forms occupying the center of carefully chosen surfaces. They are not portraits of ordinary people. They are something else. Something that inhabits a space between the human and the cosmic. Something that was painted not to record a face, but to make something happen. The leading interpretation, supported by decades of careful research and by the evidence of similar traditions on every inhabited continent, is that these images were made in the context of shamanistic ritual, that the people who painted them were religious specialists, entering altered states of consciousness through whatever means their tradition employed, and finding in those altered states the images that they then brought back to these canyon walls. Shamanism is one of the oldest religious traditions in the world, perhaps the oldest. It appears, in recognizable form, in the rock art of South Africa, in the cave paintings of Europe, in the traditions of Siberia and Australia and the Americas. Different in its specific content from culture to culture, but recognizable in its underlying structure. The shaman travels between worlds, enters the spirit world through trance or dream or other means, encounters the beings who inhabit that other world, returns with knowledge or power or healing, and sometimes returns with images. Images that need to be made permanent, that need to be placed in a specific location, on a specific wall, in a specific relationship to the other images already there. The people who painted the lower Pecos Canyon walls were not making decoration. They were not making art in our modern sense, a product intended for aesthetic contemplation by others. They were doing something that required these specific images in this specific place, something that mattered enormously to them and to their community. What exactly that something was, we cannot know with certainty. The specific beliefs, the specific rituals, the specific meanings attached to specific images, all of that is lost with the people who made them. But we can stand before these paintings and feel the seriousness of them. The weight of intention, the certainty that this was important. That the person who mixed these pigments and applied them to this rock wall was not doing something casual. They were doing something that they believed could change things. And in a way, they were right. Because the paintings are still here, and we are still affected by them. The land between the lower Pecos Canyon country and the hill country to the east is traversed by rivers that have been, for as long as people have lived here, the organizing arteries of human life. The Pecos itself, running south to join the Rio Grande. The Devil's River, one of the clearest streams in Texas, its spring-fed waters cold, even in summer. The Nueces, beginning in the hill country and flowing south toward the Gulf. The Frio, the Medina, the Guadalupe. These rivers were not just water sources. They were highways, their valleys offering the easiest travel through a landscape of hills and canyons that punished anyone who tried to move across country without regard for the terrain. And along these rivers, at every reliable spring and every convenient ford and every sheltered overhang, people stopped. The accumulated evidence of tens of thousands of stops over 15,000 years makes the river valleys of Texas among the richest archaeological landscapes in North America. Almost everywhere you dig, you find something. A hearth, a scatter of flint chips from tool-making, a fragment of pottery, occasionally something more spectacular. But the river valleys hold another kind of legacy as well, not the material legacy of the tools and the hearths, but the living legacy of the knowledge that accumulated along these rivers over thousands of years. The people who knew these rivers best knew where the water was in dry years, which springs were reliable and which were seasonal. They knew which plants grew along the river margins and when they were ready to harvest. They knew the behavior of the fish in different seasons, where they concentrated in cold weather and how they moved in the spring floods. They knew the paths that deer and turkey used to come to water at dawn and dusk. This knowledge was not written anywhere. It lived in people. It was passed from older people to younger people through the direct experience of living on the land together. Through seasons of watching and learning, through the accumulation of 1,000 small lessons absorbed without formal instruction, it was, by any measure, an extraordinary body of knowledge. And almost all of it is lost. The Texas Hill Country, rising from the coastal plain along the Balcones Escarpment, has been a special place in the human story of Texas since the earliest people arrived. The escarpment itself is a significant geological feature, a line where the hard limestone of the Edwards Plateau meets the softer soils of the coastal plain, and where the aquifer that underlies much of central Texas discharges at the surface in dozens of springs. These springs, the Barton Springs and the San Marcos Springs and the Comal Springs and dozens of others, have been reliable sources of water for at least 13,000 years. People have been gathering at these springs for all of that time. Barton Springs, in what is now the city of Austin, flows from the base of the Balcones Escarpment at a rate that has been more or less constant for thousands of years. The spring-fed pool it creates has been a gathering place since the earliest humans arrived in the hill country. 13,000 years of people coming to this water. 13,000 years. The Austin skyline looms above the spring now, the towers of a modern city surrounding this ancient water. But the spring itself is unchanged. The same temperature year-round. The same clarity. The same quality of coldness on a hot day that must have felt to a Paleo-Indian hunter arriving after a long march across the summer plain, like exactly the gift it was. The San Marcos Springs, feeding the San Marcos River, are similarly ancient in their use. People have been coming here for at least 13,000 years as well, their campsites and their tools accumulating in the sediment of the river valley in layer upon layer of human presence. Springs were special, not just practically, though they were practically essential, but symbolically, cosmologically, in the understanding of the ancient peoples who used them. Water emerging from the earth is not a natural thing, in the way that rain is natural. Rain falls from the sky, which is where water is supposed to come from, in the logic of the visible world. But water coming from the rock, from the ground, from the earth itself, that is something different. That water has been somewhere. It has passed through the interior of the earth, through the dark and the pressure of the deep places, and has emerged here, at this specific spot, cold and clear and apparently inexhaustible. Every culture that has encountered springs has found them significant, has attributed them to divine agency, or to spirits, or to the deep powers of the earth, has treated them as entrances to the underworld, as sacred sites, as places where the ordinary world and the other world come into contact. The ancient peoples of Texas were no different. The springs were special. The springs were watched and cared for and visited with more than merely practical intent. What rituals were performed at these springs, what prayers were said, what offerings were made, we do not know. The springs will not tell us. They simply flow, as they have always flowed, as they will, we hope, flow for a long time to come. The aquifer that feeds these springs is called the Edwards Aquifer. It is one of the most productive aquifers in North America, holding an enormous volume of water in the porous limestone of the Edwards Formation, replenished by rainfall on the Balcones Escarpment and the hill country above. But the limestone that contains this water is itself a mystery, or rather, it is a record of a time so distant that it strains the imagination to hold it. The Edwards limestone was laid down during the Cretaceous period, roughly 100 million years ago. At that time, the land that would eventually become Texas did not exist as land. It was the floor of a shallow inland sea, the Western Interior Seaway, that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Arctic Ocean, dividing the North American continent into two land masses. This sea was warm and productive. Sunlight filtered down through clear tropical water to a seafloor covered in coral reefs and shell beds and the endless slow rain of the tiny planktonic organisms that drifted in. The surface waters above. When these organisms died, their shells, made of calcium carbonate, drifted down to the seafloor and accumulated there in thick layers. Over millions of years, these layers were compressed and cemented into limestone. The individual shells, too small to see without a microscope in most cases, became invisible components of a rock formation that now extends across thousands of square miles of central Texas. And within that limestone, in the larger and more dramatic forms, the record of the Cretaceous Sea is preserved in extraordinary detail. Ammonites, coiled like the shells of modern nautiluses, but sometimes as large as a truck tire, their spiral chambers still visible in the pale stone. Oysters of kinds that no longer exist, their shells thicker and more massive than any modern oyster. Corals, their structures frozen in the moment of their death, the architectural logic of the colony preserved in rock, and occasionally the bones of the large animals that swam in those ancient seas. The mosasaur, that great marine reptile of the Cretaceous, left its bones in the limestone of Texas, some of them enormous, the vertebrae the size of dinner plates, the teeth long and curved and designed for seizing slippery prey. These were real animals. They swam in real waters. They hunted and were hunted, and they died, and their bodies sank to the seafloor of the ancient Texas Sea, and the sediment covered them, and over 100 million years they became stone. And now, in the road cuts and riverbeds of the hill country, they emerge, reaching the surface again after their long burial. Looking up, for the first time in 100 million years, at the Texas sky, The sky. Let us talk about the sky. Because for all of the mysteries we have explored tonight, the most intimate and the most ancient mystery of Texas may be the sky above it. The ancient peoples of Texas, every culture from the Paleo-Indian hunters of 15,000 years ago to the Apache horsemen of the 18th century, lived under this sky. Watched it, learned from it, built their understanding of time and season and direction and the nature of the cosmos from the information it contained. And the sky of ancient Texas was a sky almost no one alive today has ever seen. We live in a world of light pollution. Even in the rural areas of Texas, which are less affected than most of the country, the glow of distant cities on the horizon reduces the darkness of the night sky. The faintest stars are invisible. The Milky Way, if visible at all, is a pale suggestion of itself. But go far enough into the Trans-Pecos on a night when the moon is below the horizon, and the sky becomes something else entirely. The stars are not points of light scattered against darkness. They are a presence. A density, a river of light so broad and so bright that it casts a faint shadow that you can read by if you have good eyes and a patience for it, that fills the sky from horizon to horizon, with a luminosity that seems almost physical. This is the sky the ancient Texans saw every clear night. Every single clear night of their lives. From birth to death, this was the ceiling of their world, the great clock and compass of their existence, the canvas onto which their stories were projected, and they watched it with an attention we can barely imagine. We have the luxury of not paying attention to the sky. We have clocks that tell us the time without reference to the sun. We have calendars that track the seasons without our having to watch the stars. We have GPS navigation that tells us where we are without reference to the North Star. The ancient Texans had none of these things. They had the sky. And from the sky, through patient, sustained, intergenerational observation, they extracted everything they needed to know about time and season and direction and the deep rhythms of the world. The Caddo, whose architecture shows evidence of deliberate celestial alignment, knew which direction the sun rose on the solstices. They may have known the cycle of the moon well enough to predict eclipses. They certainly knew the heliacal risings of particular stars, the moment each year when a star reappears in the pre-dawn sky after its period of invisibility, which marked the turning of the agricultural calendar. The Apache knew the stars as landmarks and as calendar. Moving across the vast featureless plains of the Llano Estacado at night, the stars were the only reliable guide. A warrior who knew the sky could navigate with confidence in total darkness across a landscape that would be completely disorienting by day. The ancient rock art of the Trans-Pecos contains images that researchers have suggested might represent celestial events. Circular forms that might be stars, radiant forms that might be comets or supernovae, the crescent and the star that might record a specific conjunction of the moon and a particularly bright planet or exploding star. In the year 1006 of the Common Era, a star in the southern sky suddenly became the brightest object in the night sky after the moon. Bright enough to cast shadows. Visible in the daytime, a supernova, the explosion of a massive star 7,000 light-years away, whose light had been traveling toward Earth for 7 millennia before arriving in April of that year and announcing itself to every person on the planet who happened to look up at the sky. In China, astronomers recorded it. In the Islamic world, scholars noted it. In Europe, monks wrote of it in their chronicles. And in the rock art of the American Southwest, near the Texas border, there is what appears to be a depiction of this event, a bright star beside a crescent moon in the position where the supernova appeared. Did the ancient peoples of Texas see it? Of course they did. On that April night in 1006, anyone in Texas who stepped outside and looked south would have seen the new star burning in the sky, impossibly bright, in a place where no star had been before, burning with a light that did not flicker, that did not move, that was simply there, where nothing had been, with a constancy that made it more unsettling than any meteor or comet. What did they make of it? What stories were told in the campfires of the Caddo villages and the Transpecos shelters on the night that new star appeared? What did the elders say to the children who had never seen anything like this and had no frame of reference for understanding it? We will never know. But we can be certain that they noticed, that they watched, that they talked about it, that they tried to understand. Because that is what human beings do. We notice, we watch, we talk, we try to understand. Across all the differences of culture and time and language and circumstance, that impulse is constant. It is the impulse that drives science, that drives religion, that drives art, that drives the telling of stories on a long dark night when there is nothing to do but sit by the fire and wonder about the world. It is the impulse that is driving you to listen, right now, to this long meditation on ancient things. The same impulse that moved a person to paint a figure on a canyon wall 4,000 years ago. The same impulse that moved someone to carry a piece of copper 1,000 miles from the Great Lakes to East Texas. Because it seemed important. Because it seemed like the right thing to do with such a beautiful material. The same impulse that moved the Caddo to build their mounds, not just for practical reasons, but for reasons that exceeded the practical. Reasons that had to do with meaning. And permanence and the human need to make something that will last. We are not so different from them. We are them further along in the story, wearing different clothes, speaking different languages, living in a world made unrecognizable by technology and time. But underneath all of that, the same questions, the same wonder, the same reaching towards something we cannot quite name. The night is very deep now. You have traveled a long way since we began, through 15,000 years of human life in Texas, through the Ice Age hunters and the Caddo farmers and the Transpecos artists and the Apache horsemen and the vanished Jumano, through the deep geological past of the Edwards limestone and the Cretaceous Sea and the creatures that swam in it 100 million years ago, through the painted caves and the sacred springs and the ancient trade routes and the buried coastlines of the Gulf, through all of it. And now it is time to rest. Not because there is nothing more to say. There is always more to say about ancient Texas. Every question opens 3 more questions. Every answered mystery reveals a room full of deeper mysteries. The story is inexhaustible, but you have done enough for one night. You have held in your mind for a little while the weight of 15,000 years of human life on this land, the weight of all those people who were as real as you are, who felt the same kinds of things you feel, who looked at the same stars and the same rivers and the same horizon, and wondered about the same things you wonder about. That is not a small thing to hold. Let it settle in you now, as you drift towards sleep. Let it take its proper place in whatever corner of your mind holds the things that matter without being urgent, the things that are important not because they demand action, but because they illuminate the world. The ancient Texans are gone. They are part of the stone now, part of the soil, part of the water that flows through the aquifer under the hill country and emerges cold and clear at the springs where people have been coming to drink for 13,000 years. But they are also, in a way that is more than metaphor, present. present in the landscape they shaped over 15,000 years of living on it, present in the knowledge that their descendants carry, in the Caddo Nation and the Apache communities and the many other peoples whose roots go deep into this Texas soil, present in the mystery of who they were, which is still asking to be explored, and present, perhaps, in you, in the part of you that responds to ancient things. That finds something comforting in deep time, that is calmed, rather than disturbed, by the recognition that you are part of a very long story. The part of you that is listening tonight, let that part of you rest now. Let it be carried down into sleep by the long, quiet current of all that ancient time. The sky is full of stars. The earth is full of secrets. And you are, as the ancient Texans always were, exactly where you are supposed to be in this moment. In this breath. Drifting. Deeper. Into the soft, warm dark. Into sleep. The desert of far west Texas holds its secrets differently than the rest of the state. In the east, the secrets are buried, covered by centuries of fallen leaves and accumulated soil, hidden under the red clay of the piney woods, sealed away in the sediment of slow rivers. You have to dig to find them. But in the Trans-Pecos, in the vast dry country where the Chihuahuan Desert meets the sky, the secrets are exposed. The land here has been stripped by wind and rare but violent rain. The thin soils are scoured away, leaving bare rock, bare desert pavement, the ancient surface of the earth laid open like a wound that never quite heals. And in that exposure, the record of the past is visible in ways that would be impossible in a wetter landscape. Drive south from the town of Marfa, through the grasslands that spread across the high basins between the mountain ranges, and you enter a landscape that feels genuinely ancient. The mountains on the horizon, the Chisos and the Chinati and the Davis Mountains, are volcanic in origin, the remnants of enormous eruptions that reshaped this region between 20 and 35 million years ago. Their profiles are ragged and dramatic, unlike the smooth limestone hills of the Edwards Plateau. They were made by violence, by the eruption of magma through the surface of the earth, by the collapse of calderas and the slow accumulation of ash and lava and the solidified flows of ancient rock. In the valleys between these mountains, the ancient peoples moved. Not in great numbers. This landscape has never supported great numbers, but steadily, across thousands of years, the Trans-Pecos was inhabited by people who had learned to read its particular harshness as a kind of abundance. The desert is not empty. To a person who does not know it, the Chihuahuan Desert looks empty. Sparse grass, scattered shrubs, bare rock. The occasional hawk riding a thermal overhead, long distances between any visible sign of life. But to a person who knows it, the desert is full of plants whose water-storing strategies are masterpieces of evolutionary engineering. The lechugia, that low-growing agave whose leaves end in needles sharp enough to punch through leather, whose buried heart is nutritious when roasted, and whose fiber can be twisted into rope strong enough to lower a person down a cliff face. The sotol, similar in form, with its own cache of carbohydrates in its base. The prickly pear cactus, whose flat pads can be peeled and eaten raw, whose red and purple fruits are sweet and full of water when ripe, whose flowers are briefly and brilliantly beautiful in spring, full of animals that have learned to live without abundant water. Mule deer, whose large ears and efficient kidneys allow them to survive on the moisture in the plants they eat during dry spells. Javelinas, the small pig-like animals whose social structure and range of diet make them supremely adaptable. Roadrunners, which catch and eat rattlesnakes. And the rattlesnakes themselves capable of going months without water, waiting with geological patience for the mouse or the bird that will provide both food and moisture at once. Full of water, hidden but present in the rock tanks called tinajas that collect rainwater and hold it for weeks. In the springs that emerge in the lower elevations where the water table intersects the surface. In the roots of desert plants that have been drawing water from deep underground for decades. The ancient peoples of the Trans-Pecos knew where all of this was, every tinaja in 100 miles, every spring, permanent and seasonal, every plant that was ready to harvest in every month of the year, every likely location for the deer and the pronghorn, and the smaller game that supplemented the plant foods. This knowledge was the map of the desert. Not a map made of lines on paper, but a map made of memory and experience, and the stories that encoded both. A living map, carried in the minds of the people who needed it, updated continuously as the landscape changed and as new things were learned. It was a map more detailed and more useful than anything a satellite could produce, because it included not just the locations of things, but their character and their season, and their relationship to everything else around them. And it is almost entirely lost. The Hueco tanks, east of El Paso in the far western corner of the state, are one of the most extraordinary places in all of Texas. From a distance, they do not look like much. A low cluster of rocky hills rising from the flat desert floor, their outlines irregular against the mountain ranges behind them. Not tall, not dramatically positioned, not the kind of landscape feature that announces itself as significant. But come closer. The hills are made of syenite, a coarse-grained igneous rock similar in composition to granite, and they have been shaped by millions of years of weathering into a labyrinth of boulders and passageways and chambers and overhangs that has no parallel in the region. The Spanish word hueco means hollow, and the tanks of the name are the natural basins worn into the rock surface by the dissolving action of slightly acidic rainwater over thousands of years. These basins fill when it rains and hold water for weeks afterward, sometimes months, in the deepest ones. In a desert where water is the organizing principle of everything, a place with reliable water basins is beyond valuable. It is sacred. People have been coming to Hueco tanks for water for at least 10,000 years. The archaeological record of the site stretches back to the earliest Paleo-Indian period and continues, almost without interruption, to the present day. And almost everyone who came here across those 10,000 years left something behind. The rock art of Hueco tanks is one of the great concentrations of pictographs in North America. More than 3,000 individual images, painted or carved onto the rock surfaces of the site, accumulated over thousands of years by hundreds of artists from dozens of different cultural traditions. The oldest images are simple, geometric forms, handprints, the outlines of animals. Made with the ochre and charcoal that were available to the earliest visitors, applied directly to the rock with fingers or with simple brushes of plant fiber. But as the centuries pass and the layers accumulate, the images become more complex, more culturally specific, more loaded with meaning that we can partially decode and partially only guess at. The Jornada Mogollon people, who occupied this region roughly between 900 and 1400 of the Common Era, left behind a body of imagery that is both distinctive and haunting. Their masks are the most immediately striking element. Human faces, highly stylized, their features reduced to the essential elements of eyes and nose and mouth, but arranged in ways that are more than merely schematic. These are not simple stick-figure faces. They have presence. They have character. Each one is different from the others in subtle ways that suggest they were not just a type, a generic symbol for the human face, but specific images, specific beings, specific presences that the Jornada Mogollon understood and related to in particular ways. The masks are associated with rain and water. This is not surprising. In a desert landscape where life depends on water, the beings associated with rain are among the most important in the cosmos. The Jornada Mogollon were a farming people, growing corn in the river valleys when they could and relying on desert resources when the rains failed. For them, as for farmers everywhere in the arid southwest, the coming of rain was not just a meteorological event. It was a cosmic one, a sign that the relationship between the human world and the powers that governed it was in balance, that the prayers and the ceremonies and the offerings had been received and answered. The masks at Huecotanks may have been part of that relationship, may have been placed here at this water-rich place as a kind of communication with the powers of rain and moisture. An acknowledgement that this place was special, that the water here was a gift, that the gift was recognized and appreciated, or they may have been something else entirely. We do not know. What we know is that they are here, that they were made with care and intention, that the people who made them believed they mattered, and standing before them, in the cool shadow of the boulder that shelters them from the desert sun, you feel the weight of that belief. The accumulated intention of 1,000 years of people coming to this place with something to offer and something to ask for. The rock holds it, quietly, patiently, as it has always held everything. The Guadalupe Mountains rise abruptly from the flat desert floor in the far corner of West Texas, near the New Mexico border. From a distance, they look like the prow of a great ship emerging from the desert. The highest point in Texas, Guadalupe Peak, rises to 8,751 feet above sea level, and from its summit you can see, on a clear day, 100 miles in every direction. But the most remarkable thing about the Guadalupe Mountains is not their height, it is what they are made of. The Guadalupe Mountains are a fossil reef, the Permian Reef, to be precise. A structure built by marine organisms in a warm, shallow sea roughly 265 million years ago. A reef in the same sense that the Great Barrier Reef of Australia is a reef, an enormous living structure built by the accumulated calcium carbonate secretions of billions of tiny organisms, corals and sponges, and the shells of mollusks and the tests of foraminifera, layer upon layer upon layer, over millions of years. When the sea that surrounded this reef retreated, roughly 250 million years ago, the reef was exposed. It dried. It was buried by later sediments. And then, over tens of millions of years of geological uplift and erosion, it was gradually exposed again. The softer rocks that had buried it were worn away, and the hard limestone of the ancient reef, more resistant to erosion, stood firm. And here it is today, rising from the Chihuahuan Desert, a mountain range made of ancient life. Every rock face in the Guadalupes is composed of the remains of organisms that lived and died and fell to the seafloor 250 million years ago. In some exposures, the fossils are visible, the chambers of ancient sponges, the curved shapes of brachiopods, the long, thin forms of the organisms that are known only from this period and this environment. Things that look like no living creature, but that were clearly once alive. Clearly once part of the teeming community of life that built this reef over millions of years. The ancient peoples who lived around the Guadalupes did not know what the mountains were made of. Or perhaps they did, in their own way. Perhaps they noticed the shells in the rock, the curved and spiraled forms that appeared in the limestone of the canyon walls and the talus slopes. Perhaps they had stories about what these shapes meant, about the sea that had once been here, about the world that had existed before their world. We do not know. What we know is that they came here. The caves and overhangs of the Guadalupe Mountains sheltered people for thousands of years. The springs in the canyons provided water. The higher elevations, cooler in summer, provided refuge from the desert heat. And like everywhere else in Texas where ancient people lived, they left traces. Hearths. Tool-making debris. Rock art in some sheltered locations. The record of presence. The record of lives. Moving north from the Guadalupes, across the great flat expanse of the Llano Estacado, you enter a landscape that feels like the edge of the world. The Llano Estacado is a plateau, but not a dramatic one. There are no mountain ranges on its horizon, no valleys cutting through its surface. It is simply flat. Flat in a way that goes beyond ordinary flatness. Flat in a way that seems intentional, as though the earth has made an effort to be as level as possible. This plateau was built by the outwash of sediment from the Rocky Mountains to the west, material carried east by streams over millions of years and deposited in sheets across the ancient basin of eastern New Mexico and the Texas Panhandle. Layer after layer of sand and gravel and fine-grained sediment laid down so evenly that the surface that resulted is as flat as a table. The wind here is constant, not always strong, but always present. It moves across the grass in long waves, sets the windmill blades spinning, carries the red dust of the unpaved roads far to the east in plumes that can be seen for miles. In summer it is hot and dry. In winter it is cold and relentless, the northern winds that drop the temperature 40 degrees in an hour arriving without mercy from the north. The ancient peoples of the Llano Estacado were among the toughest people who have ever lived in Texas. Not in the sense of being violent or aggressive, though they were certainly capable of defending themselves and their resources. Tough in the sense of genuinely adapted to a genuinely harsh environment. The cold winters, the summer droughts, the distances between water, the way a plains thunderstorm can turn a dry arroyo into a roaring flood in 20 minutes. They were primarily bison hunters. The great southern herd of bison that once covered the southern plains was one of the most remarkable concentrations of large mammals in the history of the world. Estimates of the pre-contact bison population of North America range from 30 to 60 million animals. 60 million. The plains from Texas to Canada were black with them. A single adult bison provides several hundred pounds of meat. Its hide can be worked into robes and teepee covers. Its sinew provides bowstring and thread. Its bones can be shaped into tools. Its stomach can serve as a cooking vessel. Its dried dung, buffalo chips, burns hot enough to cook a meal in a landscape where wood is scarce. To be a skilled bison hunter on the southern plains was to have access to almost everything a person needed. But bison hunting requires skill and courage and a deep knowledge of bison behavior. The herds moved. They were not always in the same place. Finding them required knowledge of the landscape and of the patterns of bison movement that came from long experience. Getting close enough to kill required either extraordinary stealth or the cooperation of many hunters working together to drive animals toward a kill zone. The ancient bison hunters of the Llano Estacado used both strategies. The solitary hunter, moving downwind through the tall grass, wrapped in a bison robe to mask the human scent, crawling on hands and knees across hundreds of yards of open prairie to get within spear throw of a grazing animal. This required patience and skill and a degree of physical endurance that few modern people could match. And the communal hunt, groups of hunters working together to drive a herd toward a cliff edge or a box canyon or a constructed barrier of rocks and brush. The animals, alarmed and running, channeled by the shouting hunters into a space from which there was no escape. The kill made quickly and efficiently by hunters waiting at the end of the drive. Archaeological evidence for both strategies is found across the Llano Estacado. The bones of many bison killed together in a single event at specific locations. The scattered remains of solitary kills, a single animal butchered at a specific spot, and then the hunters moving on. Life on the plains was mobile, structured around the movements of the herd, requiring a relationship with the landscape that was not rooted, not fixed to a single place, but fluid and responsive and always aware of the patterns of movement that governed the whole system. It was, in its own way, a civilization as sophisticated as the Caddos. Not organized around agriculture and permanent villages and trade networks, organized around movement and knowledge and the extraordinary relationship between hunter and hunted that the plains peoples developed over thousands of years. Along the Canadian River, which cuts through the Panhandle in a series of red-walled canyons that break the monotony of the surrounding flatness, there is a quarry. The Alabates Flint Quarries. We have mentioned this place before, but it deserves a longer visit. The flint that outcrops here in shallow pits along the bluffs above the Canadian River is unlike any other flint in North America. It is beautiful. That is the first thing anyone says about Alabates flint, and it is true in a way that goes beyond ordinary appreciation of pattern and color. The swirling reds and purples and creams and whites in the stone, produced by trace amounts of different minerals in the silica, create patterns that seem almost intentional, as though someone had designed this material to be aesthetically striking, not just functionally useful. A blade made from Alabates flint catches the light in a way that plain grey chert does not, holds it, seems almost to glow from within, and people noticed. People have been quarrying Alabates flint for at least 13,000 years. The shallow pits that dot the quarry area are not geological features. They were dug by human hands, one generation adding to what the previous generation had excavated, the pits growing slowly deeper across millennia as the flint knappers worked their way down through the limestone overburden to reach the productive seams below. 13,000 years of mining by hand with stone tools, and then with bone tools, and then with whatever was available, and the material they extracted traveled. Alabates flint has been found at archaeological sites in Montana, in Kansas, in Nebraska, in Colorado, in New Mexico, in Oklahoma. At some of these sites, the Alabates material is present in quantity, suggesting regular and intentional trade rather than occasional chance acquisition. At others, it appears as a single piece, perhaps passed through many hands before arriving so far from its source. How did it travel? Not by wheeled cart or pack animal, at least not until the horse arrived in the 16th century. On human backs, primarily, or in the hands of paddlers carried in canoes along the river systems that connected the plains to the east and the south. The movement of Alabates flint across the southern plains and beyond is a map of human connection. Each piece that traveled far from its source traveled through hands, passed from person to person, community to community, relationship to relationship. Think of the number of individual transactions involved in moving a single piece of flint from the Canadian River in Texas to a site in Montana. Each transaction was a relationship, a moment of meeting between two people or two groups who had something to offer each other. The flint moving north or east or west in exchange for other things moving back toward the source. Hides, perhaps, dried meat, specific plant products available only in other regions. Information, stories, news. The ancient trade networks of North America were not abstract economic systems. They were webs of personal relationship maintained through repeated contact and mutual benefit, vulnerable to disruption by conflict or disease or the movement of peoples, but resilient enough to persist across centuries because the people who maintained them found them genuinely valuable. Valuable not just economically, but socially, culturally, humanly. The distant trading partner was also, in some sense, kin. connected by the relationship of exchange, by the shared understanding that what flowed between them was not just goods but trust. And Alabate's flint was one of the threads in that web, a distinctive, beautiful, recognizable thread that said, to anyone who knew it, this came from a specific place. From the Canadian River country. From the people who lived there and knew where the good flint was and took the time to quarry it and work it and send it out into the world. The Texas Panhandle has another ancient mystery that most people have never heard of. Below the surface of the Llano Estacado, in the porous rock of the ancient aquifer, lies an enormous volume of water. The Ogallala Aquifer. One of the largest freshwater aquifers in the world, it underlies 8 states and provides water for one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. Today, it is being pumped faster than it recharges, a slow-motion crisis that will eventually transform the southern plains as dramatically as any drought or ice age. But the Ogallala has been here for a very long time. It was formed during the Miocene and Pliocene epochs, roughly between 5 and 20 million years ago, when the Rocky Mountains were young and their streams carried enormous quantities of sediment eastward onto the plains. This sediment was porous, and it trapped the water that fell on the plains and flowed eastward through it, accumulating over millions of years into the vast underground reservoir that the Ogallala represents. Before European-American settlement began depleting it in the 20th century, the Ogallala was fully charged. Its water table was higher, in many places, than it is today. Springs emerged from the base of the Llano Estacado escarpment, where none flow today. Streams were more reliable, their base flow maintained by the slow seepage of aquifer water through the spring-fed headwaters. The ancient peoples of the Panhandle and the southern plains lived in a landscape shaped, in significant part, by the abundance of this water. The springs it fed, the streams it maintained, the wetlands it supported in low areas where the water table intersected the surface. This was not the desert that much of the Panhandle can appear to be in dry years today. It was a landscape of surprising green. Of cattail marshes around the playa, those shallow circular lakes that dot the Llano Estacado and fill with water after rains. Of willows along the stream banks. Of tall grass prairie that was genuinely tall, not the short sparse grass of an overgrazed, overploughed, overpumped modern landscape. The bison lived in this landscape because it supported them. And the people who followed the bison lived here for the same reason. The relationship between the ancient peoples of the southern plains and the water that sustained their world is a relationship we can barely begin to understand, because the world they inhabited has changed so dramatically in the last century and a half. But traces remain. In the springs that still flow, here and there, from the base of the escarpment, in the playas that still fill with water after rain, in the cottonwood trees that still line the Canadian River, their roots reaching deep for the water that has been here since the Miocene, and in the stories that the descendants of the ancient peoples carry, stories about water and its importance, stories that encode a relationship with the hydrological landscape that is thousands of years old. South and east of the Panhandle, where the high plains give way to the rolling terrain of central Texas, the land becomes more various. The cross timbers, that narrow band of post oak and blackjack oak woodland that runs north to south through the middle of the state, was for the ancient peoples of Texas one of the most important ecological zones in the region. It was an edge, not just geographically, though it marked the transition between the grasslands of the west and the forests of the east, but ecologically, in the sense that edge habitats, the boundaries between different ecological communities, are typically more diverse and more productive than the communities on either side. Along the cross timbers, a person could find the resources of both the eastern woodland and the western grassland, within easy reach. The acorns of the oaks, the hickory nuts, the plums and persimmons and grapes that grew in the woodland edges. And out on the open prairies to the west, the bison and the pronghorn and the other game animals of the grassland. The best of both worlds. And the ancient peoples of the cross timbers understood this. The archaeological record of the cross timbers shows that these woodlands were intensively used across the full span of Texas prehistory. From the Paleo-Indian period to the time of European contact, people camped here, gathered here, hunted here, and used this landscape as a kind of pantry. The acorn was central to their diet. Acorns are extraordinarily nutritious, rich in carbohydrates, fats, and protein. Available in enormous quantities in good mast years, when the oaks produce abundantly, storable for long periods when properly dried and processed. But raw acorns are bitter. They contain tannins, the same compounds that make green tea astringent, in concentrations high enough to make them inedible. Before acorns can be eaten, the tannins must be removed. The ancient peoples of the cross timbers knew how to do this. They cracked the acorns and ground them into flour. They put the flour in baskets and set the baskets in running streams, letting the water carry away the tannins over a period of hours or days. Or they leached the flour with repeated soakings in still water, pouring off the brown tannin-laden water and replacing it with fresh water until the flour was sweet and ready to cook. The resulting acorn flour was then made into porridge, or dried into cakes, or mixed with other foods. It was a staple, a carbohydrate base for a diet supplemented by meat and fruit and other plant foods. The knowledge of how to process acorns was not obvious. It required experimentation and accumulated experience to develop. The first person who tasted a bitter raw acorn and thought to leach it with water was making a discovery that would feed generations. That discovery is thousands of years old, and it was made here, in the cross timbers of Texas, by a person whose name we will never know, whose face we cannot imagine, whose contribution to human life on this land was as significant as any toolmaker or mound builder. The anonymous discoverers are everywhere in the archaeological record. Every useful plant whose preparation requires knowledge. Every trap design. Every method of waterproofing. Every technique for starting fire in wet weather. Every observation about the behavior of game animals that made hunting more reliable. All of it was discovered by someone, at some specific moment, in some specific place. And none of those moments were recorded. They are the invisible foundation of everything that built on them. The rivers of the central Texas Hill Country carve through the limestone in a way that creates some of the most beautiful landscape in the state. The Frio, its name meaning cold in Spanish, runs clear and cold even in summer, fed by springs that emerge from the Edwards Aquifer at a constant temperature. The Medina, the Nueces, the Guadalupe, the Llano. These rivers flow through steep-walled limestone canyons past cliffs that expose the layered geological history of the Edwards Plateau through valleys of astonishing beauty, where the crystal water and the limestone rock and the cypress trees that line the banks create something that feels almost unreal in its perfection. People have been living in these valleys for thousands of years. The archaeology of the hill country river valleys is rich and varied and still being fully explored. Every canyon has its rock shelters, the overhanging limestone ledges that provided shelter for 10,000 years of campers. Every river bend has its campsite, the accumulated debris of countless stops at a convenient location. And throughout this record, a consistent picture emerges. These were people who moved with the seasons. In winter, they camped in the sheltered lower elevations where the canyon walls blocked the cold north winds and the fires of juniper wood burned hot. In spring, they moved to the uplands, following the emerging vegetation, the plants coming into leaf and flower and fruit in a sequence they knew as well as we know the months of. The year. In summer, the rivers were their refuge. The cool water of the spring-fed streams offered relief from the Texas heat that was, without air conditioning, genuinely brutal. They fished and gathered the plants of the river margins and waited for the relief of autumn. And in fall, they moved again. To the oak woodlands for the acorn harvest, to the prairie edges for the bison that moved into central Texas in the cooler months, to the higher elevations where the juniper berries ripened and the deer fattened on autumn mast. This seasonal round, this pattern of movement through the landscape that matched the rhythm of what the landscape offered, is one of the most elegant and sophisticated ways of living that human beings have developed. It required a knowledge of the landscape that was encyclopedic in scope. Every plant, its location and its season, every animal, its behavior and its movement, every water source, its reliability across the full range of wet and dry years. And it required a social organization flexible enough to accommodate the constant movement, but stable enough to maintain the relationships and the accumulated knowledge that made the movement possible. The hill country peoples were not wanderers in the sense of being lost or random. They were following a pattern as regular and as purposeful as the seasonal migration of the birds. They knew exactly where they were going. They had always known. In the limestone bluffs above the Pecos River, near where it joins the Rio Grande, there are caves. Not dramatic caves, not the tourist caves with their stalactites and spotlighted formations, shallow shelters overhanging the river, their floors dry and protected, their pale limestone walls smooth enough to paint on. And people painted them. We have visited the Lower Pecos rock art before, but the paintings in these river shelters are worth returning to because they represent something that deserves more than a brief mention. The Pecos River style, as archaeologists call it, is one of the most sophisticated rock art traditions in North America. The paintings are large. Some of the major panels are 20 or 30 feet wide, composed of dozens of individual figures that relate to each other in ways that suggest not just accumulated images, but genuine narrative composition, scenes, or at least collections of elements that belong together. The colors are remarkable: red and yellow ochre, white from calcium carbonate, black from charcoal or manganese. These pigments were mixed with binding agents, animal fat or plant sap or egg, to create paints that have survived 4,000 years of occasional flooding and constant temperature fluctuation, with much of their vibrancy intact. The large central figures, the shamanic figures we have mentioned before, are sometimes 6 or 8 feet tall, larger than life, painted with a care and a deliberateness that must have taken many hours. The pigment applied layer upon layer to achieve the depth of color and the complexity of form. These were not made casually. Making them was a significant undertaking. It required the preparation of the pigments, the selection of the specific surface, the time and the sustained attention to complete the work. It required knowledge of how to apply paint to stone, how to use the natural textures of the rock surface to enhance the image, how to compose multiple elements into a coherent whole. And it required, perhaps most importantly, the authorization to make them. In the societies that made this kind of sacred art, not everyone had the right to paint on these walls. The paintings were not public expression in our modern sense. They were religious acts performed by people whose role in the community gave them both the knowledge and the authority to do what they were doing. The shaman, or something like what we call a shaman, a person who had undertaken the training and the ordeals that gave access to the other world, who could move between the ordinary world of daily life and the spirit world, bringing back knowledge and power that benefited the community, who knew the specific beings that inhabited the spirit world and how to relate to them, who understood the particular cosmology of this specific place and this specific tradition, and who, having made the journey, needed to record what had been seen. The paintings are, in this interpretation, not just records of visions, they are active objects, things that continue to function after they are made, that continue to participate in the relationship between the human world and the spirit world that the shamanic tradition maintains. They were placed here, on these specific walls, for reasons that were understood at the time. The reasons are lost, but the paintings remain, and they still do something. Something that cannot be fully articulated, but that anyone who has spent time in one of these shelters in the right frame of mind has felt. A presence, not supernatural, if you are not disposed to believe in the supernatural, but something. The accumulated weight of human intention over 4,000 years. The sense that this place was marked, was chosen, was used in a way that left an impression deeper than the pigment on the stone. The rock knows it, and somewhere in the part of you that is very old, very quiet, very attentive to things that exceed ordinary description, you know it too. The night animals of the Trans-Pecos move in darkness. The ringtail cat, that extraordinary creature with its raccoon face and its banded tail, picking its way along the rock ledges in search of mice and insects. The great horned owl, its silent wings carrying it across the face of a limestone cliff, its yellow eyes reading the darkness below for any movement. The western diamondback rattlesnake, moving slowly across the still warm rock to a place where it knows, from the accumulated data of its thermal sensors, that mice are likely to pass. The ancient peoples of the Trans-Pecos were also night creatures, by necessity. In summer, the daytime heat of the Chihuahuan Desert is genuinely dangerous. Temperatures above 100 degrees are common. Direct sun on exposed rock can produce surface temperatures 20 or 30 degrees higher still. Moving across that landscape in the middle of the day is, without modern water-carrying capacity, a path toward rapid dehydration. So the ancient peoples moved at dawn and dusk, rested in the shade during the hottest hours, traveled at night when necessary, using the stars and the moon to navigate across the featureless desert. And at night, they sat by their fires and watched the sky. The sky of the Trans-Pecos, on a moonless night, is one of the last places in the continental United States where the Milky Way is still fully visible, where the galaxy reveals itself in its full complexity, not as a pale smear, but as a textured, structured river of light with dark rifts and bright concentrations, with the soft glow of star clusters and the faint smudge of the Andromeda galaxy visible to the naked eye. This sky, this specific sky, was the sky above the ancient peoples of the Trans-Pecos every clear night of their lives. They watched it. They named it. They told stories about it. They used it. The specific astronomical knowledge of the Trans-Pecos peoples is not well documented. The rock art contains what may be astronomical images, but certainty is elusive. The oral traditions of the historic tribes who occupied this region in later centuries preserve pieces of sky knowledge, but how much goes back to the ancient Pecos River style? Painters is impossible to know. What we can say is that the sky above the Trans-Pecos has not changed, not in any way that would matter to a naked eye observer, in the 4,000 years since those paintings were made. The same constellations rise and set in the same directions. The moon follows the same path. The planets perform the same slow dance against the background of the fixed stars. And on a clear night in the Big Bend country, lying on your back on a flat rock with the cooling desert air on your face and the Milky Way overhead, you can feel something of what those ancient people felt. Not the specific knowledge, not the specific stories, but the wonder, the recognition of scale, of being very small under something very large. The quiet that comes when the mind stops its ordinary chatter and simply receives what is there. That feeling, that specific quality of attention that the night sky induces in human beings, is not new. It is at least 4,000 years old, and it is yours tonight if you want it. Just close your eyes. And breathe, and let the ancient sky hold you, as it has always held everyone who has ever looked up at it. The morning comes slowly in the mountains. Light finds the high peaks first, turning them gold and pink and orange while the valleys below are still grey with darkness. The air is cold and still. The birds begin before the light reaches them, their calls starting in the pre-dawn quiet as if they are calling the sun into being. In the mountain canyons of the Davis Mountains, the Guadalupes, the Chinatis, and the Christmas Mountains, the ancient peoples who sheltered here would have woken to this. Morning sequence thousands of times. The fire burning low, needing tending, the cold of the pre-dawn air, the skin contracting, the body curling instinctively toward warmth. The decision, made in the grey early light, about what the day would hold. Where the water was, whether the deer had been at the spring at first light. Which plants were ready to gather in this season, in this specific location, at this specific elevation. The endless practical intelligence of a life lived in direct relationship with the natural world. And woven through all of it, the stories. Because stories were not entertainment, not for the ancient peoples of Texas. They were technology. Stories were the medium in which knowledge was encoded for transmission across generations. The story about the time the spring went dry in the terrible drought told the listener not just about that one drought, but encoded information about the possibility of such droughts, the signs that preceded them, the strategies that had worked to survive them. The story about the dangerous plant that had made someone sick told the listener which plant to avoid and what the symptoms of its toxicity looked like, encoded in a form, memorable enough to be retained and passed on. The story about the great shamanic journey, the shaman's encounter with the beings of the spirit world, encoded the cosmological knowledge of the culture in a form that could be remembered and retold and adapted, that could carry meaning across generations without losing its essential content. Stories were the library. Stories were the school. Stories were the encyclopedia, the medical textbook, the agricultural manual, the astronomical almanac. And the stories of the ancient Texans are, with very few exceptions, entirely gone. Not because stories cannot survive. Some oral traditions have maintained their essential integrity across many generations, even under conditions of extreme disruption. But the disruptions experienced by the indigenous peoples of Texas were, in many cases, severe enough to break the transmission chains that carry oral tradition. Communities destroyed by epidemic disease, children removed from their families and forbidden to speak their languages in boarding schools, ceremonies outlawed, sacred knowledge suppressed. The result is silences. Deep, irreversible silences where there was once a living tradition. Some knowledge survives in the descendant communities. Some has been partially reconstructed from the limited documentary record. Some lives on in forms that are not always recognizable as continuous with the ancient tradition. But most of it is gone, and that is a loss that cannot be calculated. Not in economic terms, not in any terms that our usual metrics can measure. It is simply a loss. A reduction in the richness of human knowledge about this specific landscape, knowledge that was won over 15,000 years of careful attention, gone in a few generations. But here is what remains. The springs still flow. The rivers still run through the hill country limestone, cutting the same canyons that they have been cutting for thousands of years. The Milky Way still arches over the Trans-Pecos on clear nights, unchanged from the sky that the Pecos River painters knew. The grass still grows on the Llano Estacado, though thinner now than it once was. The oaks of the cross timbers still produce their acorns in good years. The Alabates flint still swirls with its distinctive red and purple patterns in the quarry pits above the Canadian River. And enchanted rock still rises from the hill country, its billion-year-old granite still warm from the sun in the early evening, still groaning in the cold hours before dawn. As it contracts after the day's heat, the land is still here, still holding the memory of everything that happened on it, still patient, still generous, still, in its own way, alive. And somewhere in the deep geological time of Texas, in the slow rhythms of aquifer and river and stone, in the patient accumulation of layer upon layer of sediment and life. And human presence is a kind of continuity, not the continuity of specific knowledge, which has been lost, but the continuity of place, of the specific quality of this specific land, shaped by 15,000 years of human presence into something that is not entirely natural, not entirely human, but something in between. A landscape that carries human intention in its bones, that was modified slowly and persistently by people who knew it and cared for it and depended on it, that was loved, that was, in every sense that matters, home. Let that word settle in you now. Home. The ancient Texans were home in this land in a way that most of us can barely imagine. Not just sheltered by it, not just dependent on it, but woven into it, connected to it at a level of intimacy and knowledge that made the distinction between the person and the place almost meaningless. You are somewhere right now, reading or listening to these words. You have a place that is home to you, or that has been home, or that you are moving toward. And in your experience of home, whatever its complexity and its history, there is something that connects you to the ancient Texans. The recognition that some places matter, that the relationship between a person and a specific piece of the earth can be something deeper than convenience. That belonging to a place, and having a place belong to you, is one of the most fundamental human needs. The ancient Texans knew this. They built their knowledge and their stories and their ceremonies around it. They shaped their entire existence to honor it. And in that honoring, they left something in the land that is still there, still present, still asking to be recognized. The night is very deep now. Your body is heavy and warm. Your breathing is slow. The ancient questions we have been exploring tonight, the questions about who the ancient Texans were and what they knew and what happened to them, do not require answers tonight. They are questions for the long arc of a lifetime. Questions that deepen as you grow older and come back to them with more experience and more patience. Tonight, they are just companions in the dark, gentle companions, asking nothing of you except to rest, except to let the weight of the day dissolve, except to let yourself be held by the same earth that held the ancient peoples of Texas across 15,000 years of days and nights, not so different from this one. The fire burns low, the stars wheel slowly overhead, the springs flow on in the dark limestone of the hill country. The ancient river channels of the Gulf of Mexico floor lie quiet under 100 feet of warm water, and somewhere in all of that stillness, in all of that depth, you are drifting deeper into the quiet that waits beyond thought, into sleep. Let it come. You are safe. You are held. You are home. Good night. There is a quality to the Texas night that is different from the night anywhere else. It is not just the darkness, though the darkness here, far from any city, is genuinely deep. It is not just the stars, though the stars here, in the right season and the right location, are genuinely overwhelming. It is something in the air itself, something in the particular combination of warmth and dryness and the faint smell of cedar and dust that makes the darkness of a Texas night feel ancient. Feel inhabited. Not inhabited in any frightening sense, not the inhabited feeling of a place where danger lurks, but inhabited in the way that a very old house can feel inhabited, even when no living person is in it. The sense that the space has been occupied by human presence for so long that the presence has become part of the structure itself. Texas nights have been inhabited for 15,000 years. 15,000 years of fires burning at dusk, of people arranging themselves for sleep under whatever shelter was available, of the last conversations of the day spoken in languages no living person understands, about matters we cannot reconstruct, of children being put to sleep with whatever the ancient Texas equivalent was of what you are hearing tonight. Stories in the dark. Soft voices, the reassurance that the world was orderly, that the night was not to be feared, that tomorrow would come. 15,000 years of human beings doing exactly what you are doing right now. Finding a place to lie down, closing their eyes, letting the darkness receive them. You are part of that lineage tonight, part of that long, unbroken chain of human beings who have ended their day in Texas under this sky, in this air, on this ancient earth. And in that recognition, if you are willing to let it in, there is a deep and particular comfort. You are not alone in this. You have never been alone in this. The darkness that surrounds you has been company for 15,000 years. The coast of Texas stretches for nearly 400 miles along the Gulf of Mexico, from the Sabine River at the Louisiana border to the Rio Grande at the Mexican one. It is not a dramatic coast in the way of rocky headlands and crashing surf. The Gulf Coast of Texas is low and gentle, barrier islands and shallow bays and wide tidal flats, the land barely rising above sea level for miles inland in many places. The water is warm and green and opaque, clouded with the sediment of the rivers that drain into it. But it is rich, extraordinarily rich, in the biological sense. The shallow bays and estuaries of the Texas coast are among the most productive marine environments in the world. The grass beds of the Laguna Madre, the seagrass meadows that carpet the bay bottoms, support astonishing concentrations of marine life. The tidal flats are feeding grounds for millions of shorebirds. The rivers that drain into the bays carry nutrients from the interior that fuel enormous blooms of phytoplankton and everything that eats phytoplankton. The ancient peoples of the Texas coast lived in this abundance, and they were not modest in taking advantage of it. The evidence of their presence is everywhere along the coast, in the shell middens that dot the shoreline and the bay margins for hundreds of miles. Shell middens are exactly what the name suggests, piles of discarded shells, the accumulated waste of countless meals of oyster and clam and scallop mixed with the other debris of long occupation. Animal bones, stone tools, pottery fragments, charcoal from ancient fires. Some of the shell middens on the Texas coast are enormous. Mounds of shell debris, 6, 8, 10 feet deep, accumulated over centuries of occupation at productive locations. These are not accidental deposits. They are the signature of people who came back to the same place, year after year, generation after generation, because the place was good. The oyster reefs of the coastal bays were productive beyond anything we experience today. Before the arrival of European settlers and the subsequent transformation of the coast by dredging and pollution and overharvesting, the Texas bays were choked with oysters. reefs so dense that they were navigational hazards, visible at low tide as great dark masses of shell and living bivalve extending for hundreds of yards from the shore. A person with a basket and a stone tool could gather 100 pounds of oysters in an afternoon without travelling more than a few steps from the water's edge. For the ancient coastal peoples of Texas, this was routine abundance, not the desperate, marginal existence that some popular accounts of prehistoric life suggest. Not a constant scramble for survival at the edge of starvation, but genuine abundance, available reliably, season after season, year after year. The archaeological record of the Texas coast shows this clearly. The people who lived here were well nourished. Their bones show the robustness that comes from adequate nutrition across a lifetime. Their settlements were stable and repeatedly occupied. They had time and energy for things beyond mere subsistence, for art, for ceremony, for the maintenance of social relationships. They were, by any reasonable measure, prospering. The Karankawa people are among the most misunderstood of all the indigenous peoples of Texas. When Spanish and later French explorers encountered the Karankawa along the Texas coast in the 17th and 18th centuries, they described them in terms that reflected more about European biases than about the Karankawa themselves. Tall, well-built, tattooed and painted, skilled with their distinctive long bows, and in some accounts, practicing cannibalism. That last characterization has followed the Karankawa through history in ways that have obscured almost everything else about them. The evidence for Karankawa cannibalism, examined carefully, is ambiguous at best. There are accounts that may reflect ritual consumption of small quantities of an enemy's flesh as part of a victory ceremony, a practice documented in many cultures around the world and carrying very different meanings in its cultural context than the word cannibalism implies to modern ears. There is no evidence for routine or subsistence cannibalism. The Karankawa were, in fact, a sophisticated coastal people who had developed an extraordinarily successful way of life adapted to the specific character of the Texas coast. They were seasonal migrants. In winter, they moved inland to escape the coast's cold north winds and to hunt deer in the interior woodlands. In summer, they returned to the coast, to the abundance of the bays and the cooling sea breezes that made the heat bearable. They were expert fishers. Their knowledge of fish behavior in the coastal bays, of the tides and the seasons and the movements of the schools, allowed them to harvest fish with an efficiency that sustained large communities. They were skilled sailors, if canoe paddlers can be called sailors. The waters of the Texas bays and the shallow Gulf shelf were their highways. They moved up and down the coast in their dugout canoes with a freedom and a facility that their landlocked contemporaries could not have matched. And they were, by every account of those who knew them well, generous. The French explorer Henri Joutel, stranded on the Texas coast after the collapse of La Salle's ill-fated colony in the 1680s, recorded that the Karankawa provided food and assistance to his desperate group when they had no other source of either. His account, whatever its other limitations, does not describe a savage or threatening people. It describes people capable of extraordinary generosity to strangers. The Karankawa are gone now. The last known members of the tribe were killed or dispersed in the 19th century, their population destroyed by disease and by the deliberate violence of Anglo-American settlers who found the coast they had lived on for centuries inconveniently occupied. Their language is extinct. No fluent speakers remain. The vocabulary and grammar that their ancestors developed over thousands of years to describe the specific character of their specific world is irretrievably gone. What remains is the archaeological record, the shell middens, the tools and ornaments found within them, the faint outline of a way of life adapted over generations to the specific rhythms and resources of the Texas coast. and the coast itself. Still there, the shallow bays and the barrier islands and the warm green water of the Gulf, changed by 2 centuries of intensive human activity, but recognizable. Still bearing some resemblance to the coast the Karankawa knew. Still, in its own way, remembering. The Tonkawa were the people of the central Texas river valleys. Their territory, in the historic period, stretched across the hill country and the adjacent prairies, roughly from the Colorado River south to the Guadalupe and east to the Brazos. It was a landscape that combined the ecological richness of multiple zones, the spring-fed rivers and the oak woodlands and the prairies and the edges of the cross timbers. The Tonkawa were hunter-gatherers, primarily. They hunted deer and turkey and smaller game. They gathered the abundant plant foods of the hill country. They fished the clear running rivers. They harvested the fall acorn crop and stored it against the winter. But the Tonkawa also participated in the wider trade networks of the region. Their territory sat at a crossroads, between the coastal peoples to the southeast and the plains peoples to the northwest, between the eastern Caddo world and the western Apache. Territory. Goods and ideas moved through their country from multiple directions. The Tonkawa had a reputation among other native peoples and among Spanish observers as skilled trackers and hunters. Their knowledge of the hill country landscape was encyclopedic, built up across generations of intimate occupation of a terrain that required, for successful hunting, an extraordinarily detailed understanding of animal behavior and landscape character. A Tonkawa hunter pursuing a deer through the cedar breaks of the hill country was not just a person chasing an animal. He was a reader of the landscape, interpreting dozens of small signs simultaneously. The direction of the wind and how it would carry his scent. The quality of the light and how it would affect his visibility. The specific character of this piece of ground and where, given all of these factors, the deer was likely to be. This kind of hunting knowledge is not instinct, it is learned. It is built up through years of watching and practicing and failing and trying again, under the guidance of more experienced hunters who share what they know. It is, in its own way, a science, a rigorous, evidence-based, continuously tested science of the natural world. The Tonkawa's science of the hill country was among the most sophisticated bodies of knowledge about that landscape that has ever existed. And it is gone. The Tonkawa were decimated by the same forces that destroyed so many native peoples: disease, displacement, the violence of conflicting colonial powers, and later of the Anglo-American settlement that transformed the hill country in the 19th century. A small number of Tonkawa descendants are enrolled in the Tonkawa tribe of Oklahoma today. The language, once thought extinct, is being partially revitalized through documentary records and the work of committed language activists. But the full depth of the old knowledge, the 1,000-year accumulation of understanding about the hill country and its creatures and its patterns, is not recoverable. It lives, perhaps, in fragments, in inherited instincts and half-remembered practices and the deep cellular memory of a people who was shaped by this landscape for generations. But the explicit, transmissible, fully articulated knowledge is gone. And in its going, the hill country became, in a very real sense, less known than it had been before. There is a spring in the hill country that has no official name. It emerges from the limestone at the base of a low cliff, barely visible in the cedar brush. Its flow so small that in dry years it may be no more than a seep. The water it produces is cold even in August, clear. It tastes of limestone and nothing else, the cleanest taste that water can have. A deer trail comes to this spring from the north, worn into the red clay by 1,000 years of hooves. A second trail approaches from the south, equally worn. At the spring itself, the ground is churned by the tracks of deer and turkey and coyote and ringtail and the dozens of other animals that know this water is here. People knew it too. In the soil beside the spring, if you knew where to look and had the patience to excavate carefully, you would find the layers of human presence. The chert chips from tool making, the fire-cracked rock from ancient hearths, a pottery shard perhaps from one of the later occupations. The charcoal of fires. Nobody knows this spring is there except the animals and the occasional deer hunter who stumbles across it. It has no name on any map. But it has a name. It had a name in the language of the people who came here for its water across 1,000 years of seasons. A name that described its location or its character or the story associated with it, or the name of the person who first found it. That name is gone. The spring remains, still flowing, still cold, still receiving the animals who come to drink from it in the grey dawn and the quiet dusk, still, in its patient way, waiting for someone to learn its name again. The concept of sacred geography, the understanding that specific places in the landscape have spiritual significance, is universal in human cultures. Every human society that we know of, in every corner of the world, has recognized that some places are different from other places, that some locations carry a quality of power or meaning or connection to the divine, or to the dead, or to the deep forces that underlie the visible world that other locations do not have. Mountains, springs, rivers, caves, groves of specific trees, crossroads, the places where lightning strikes repeatedly, the places where two rivers meet. These places accumulate meaning over time as people bring their prayers and their offerings and their experiences to them. As stories attach to them, explaining their significance and deepening it, as generations of people recognize the same quality in the same place and confirm through their recognition that the quality is real. Texas has its sacred places. Some are still recognized as such by the native peoples whose ancestors knew them. Enchanted Rock, which we have already visited in this long night, is one. The Caddo people recognize the sacred character of the mound sites and the landscapes around them. Various other communities maintain connections to specific places in Texas that are not publicly known and not publicly discussed. Places held quietly in the knowledge of those to whom they matter. But there are many more that we can only partially guess at from the archaeological evidence. The springs that have been occupied for 10 or 12,000 years. Were these simply convenient water sources, or were they also sacred? The rock art sites of the Transpecos, clearly ceremonially important, the high peaks from which the ancient peoples could have conducted the kind of skywatching that seems to have informed their ceremonial architecture. The river confluences, where the meeting of two bodies of water creates a place of concentrated natural energy that many cultures around the world have recognized as significant. We cannot know with certainty what was sacred to the ancient Texans. We can only observe that the category of the sacred, the recognition that some places are qualitatively different from others, is universal, and that a people who lived as closely as the ancient Texans did to the rhythms and the character of the land would almost certainly have recognized the sacred quality of many of the landscapes we have visited tonight. And perhaps that recognition is not entirely lost. Perhaps when you stand at the edge of a spring-fed river in the hill country and feel something that you cannot quite name, something that is not just aesthetic pleasure at the beauty of the water and the cypress trees and the limestone cliffs, but something deeper and quieter and more insistent than aesthetic pleasure, perhaps that feeling is not entirely your own invention. Perhaps it is recognition. Perhaps the place is still doing what it has always done, still expressing whatever quality caused the ancient peoples to come back to it again and again across thousands of years. And perhaps you are, in that moment of quiet feeling, receiving something that has been offered by this land to every human being who has stood in this specific place across all those thousands of years. The land gives what it has always given. We have only to be still enough to receive it. The Rio Grande is one of the great rivers of North America. It rises in the mountains of Colorado, in the San Juan Mountains near the Continental Divide, and flows south through New Mexico before turning southeast and running for almost 900 miles along the border between Texas and Mexico before emptying into the Gulf of Mexico near Brownsville. The lower Rio Grande, as it passes through Big Bend and then east to the Gulf, has been a highway and a boundary and a gathering place for as long as people have been in this part of the world. The canyon country of Big Bend, where the Rio Grande has cut its great curves through the limestone and volcanic rock of the Trans-Pecos, is one of the most spectacular landscapes in Texas. The canyon walls rise hundreds of feet above the river. The water, green and brown with sediment in wet seasons, clear and shallow in dry ones, moves through the narrow passage at a pace that varies from the dangerous speed of a flooded river to the stillness of an almost standing pool. And along those canyon walls, in every sheltered location that offered protection from the sun and the rain, people left their marks. The rock art of the Big Bend country is less studied and less well known than the Pecos River-style paintings we have already visited, but it is widespread and in places remarkably vivid. Pictographs in red and yellow ochre, abstract geometric forms, their meaning entirely opaque to us. Human figures, simplified to their essential elements, walking or standing or raising their arms. Animal forms, some clearly identifiable, deer and birds and snakes. Others more ambiguous, creatures of the spirit world perhaps, or animals whose identity we no longer recognize because they are extinct. The canyon walls of Big Bend are a library written in a script we have not learned to read. The authors are gone. The specific meanings of the specific images are lost. The tradition that would have allowed one generation to explain these images to the next was broken before that explanation could be recorded. But the images remain. Patient, permanent, asking, in their own way, to be understood. The peregrine falcon nests in the cliffs above the Rio Grande. It has nested in cliffs like these, in landscapes like this, for a very long time. The peregrine is one of the fastest animals that has ever existed, capable of diving at speeds above 200 miles an hour in pursuit of prey. Its eyes are proportionally the largest of any bird, designed to track prey across distances that would be invisible to human eyes. The ancient peoples of the Big Bend country knew the peregrine, not as a species in the taxonomic sense. They did not have the category of species, but as a specific kind of being, with a specific character and specific abilities and a specific place in the order of the world. And they painted it, or something like it. The bird images in the rock art of the Big Bend include forms that could be peregrines, or hawks, or other raptors, painted with the kind of attention to the specific character of the animal that suggests genuine familiarity. The ancient peoples watched the peregrine dive from these same cliffs, watched it strike its prey in mid-air with a force that sent feathers flying, watched it carry the prey to a ledge and begin to feed. They watched this, and they thought about it, and they incorporated what they saw into their understanding of the world. The peregrine's speed and precision was, for them, more than impressive. It was significant. It carried meaning. The specific qualities of this specific animal spoke to them about something larger than the animal itself. What exactly that something was, what the peregrine meant in the cosmology of the ancient Big Bend peoples, we do not know. But the falcon still dives from the cliff, and if you happen to be standing at the right place on the right afternoon, you can still watch it happen. The shape dropping from the rim, wings folded, the whistle of air as it descends, the strike, the burst of feathers, the recovery and the climb back to the ledge. Something that has been happening in this canyon for thousands of years. Something that the ancient peoples of Texas watched with the same recognition of beauty and power and mystery that you would feel watching it today. The world still offers this. The world still gives this. Moving east from the Big Bend country, across the broad dry basin of the Stockton Plateau, the landscape gradually softens. The volcanic rocks of the Trans-Pecos give way to the limestone of the Edwards Plateau. The mountains recede. The terrain becomes more rolling, more varied, more green in the right seasons. And then the hill country opens up, and the springs begin. We have talked about the springs before, but they deserve more time, because the springs of the Texas hill country are, in a very real sense, the life of the region. The Edwards Aquifer holds water that fell as rain on the recharge zone, the area of bare or thin-soiled limestone that takes in rainfall and roots it underground over a period of years to decades. Water that is in the aquifer today may have entered it 10 years ago, or 50 years ago, or a century ago. It has been moving slowly through the porous rock, following the gradient of the water table, heading southeast toward the zone where the aquifer discharges at the surface. And where it discharges, life concentrates. The cypress trees of the hill country rivers grow only where there is permanent water. Their roots reach deep into the riverbed and the adjacent bank, drawing water from the aquifer directly. They are among the largest and oldest trees in Texas. Some cypress trees along the Guadalupe and the Frio and the Sabinal and the other hill country rivers are centuries old, their trunks massive, their root buttresses flaring out, from the base in forms that have the look of long experience. In the shade of these ancient trees, the ancient peoples of the hill country rested. They gathered here for water, and stayed for the shade and the coolness and the abundance of food in the river margins, the fish in the clear water, the birds that nested in the cypress branches, the deer that came to drink at dawn and dusk, and they waded in the water. The temperature of a spring-fed hill country river on a July afternoon is somewhere around 68 degrees. Cold enough to take your breath away when you first enter. Cold enough to feel, after the heat of the Texas summer, like the most exquisite sensation available to a human body. The ancient peoples of the hill country felt this on hot July afternoons 15,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago. People waded into these same rivers and felt that same cold shock, and then the spreading relief as the body adjusted and the heat dissipated and the river held them in its cold, clear grip. This is one of the continuities of Texas history that is not abstract, not a continuity of ideas or knowledge or tradition, but a physical continuity, a sensory continuity. The same cold water, the same sensation, the same relief, unchanged across all the generations. The night birds of the hill country begin their calls around dusk. The chuck-will's widow, that large nightjar whose name is a reasonable approximation of its call, begins its repetitive chant as the light fades. It will call, sometimes hundreds of times without pause, through the long hours of darkness. The whip-poor will, its smaller relative, calls from the oak woodlands in a slightly higher, sharper voice. These birds were calling in the Texas hill country long before human beings arrived. They called through the Pleistocene, when mammoths drank at the springs below the limestone cliffs. They called through the post-Ice Age warming, when the grassland spread and the megafauna vanished. They called through 12,000 years of human occupation of this landscape, their voices woven into the night sounds that the ancient Texans knew as intimately as they knew their own breathing. The chuck-will's widow is still calling tonight, somewhere in the cedar breaks of the hill country. The same call, the same darkness, the same stars overhead. And if you are very still and very quiet, you can almost hear it. Almost hear the continuity of all those nights, stacked behind this one like the pages of a very old book, the bird's voice threading through all of them, unchanged and unchanging, connecting this night to all the others. There are places in Texas where the geological past and the human past overlap in ways that are both literal and deeply strange. Along the Paluxy River, near the small town of Glen Rose in the Somervell County of north-central Texas, the limestone riverbed of a 95-million-year-old tidal flat is periodically exposed by low water. And in that limestone, footprints, not human footprints. The tracks of dinosaurs, preserved in the ancient mud of the Cretaceous tidal flat, converted to stone by the slow processes of mineralization, and now revealed by the erosive action of the river. The Paluxy River tracks include some of the most spectacular dinosaur footprints in the world. The three-toed tracks of theropod dinosaurs, the bipedal predators and their relatives, are common, but the most dramatic are the enormous oval depressions left by sauropod dinosaurs, the long-necked, long-tailed giants whose tracks can be 2 or 3 feet across, pressed deep into the ancient mud by the weight of an animal that may have weighed 30 or 40 tons. The people who have lived near the Paluxy River for the last several thousand years must have noticed these tracks. They are visible in the riverbed. In low water, you can walk among them. You can stand in the footprint of a sauropod dinosaur and look around at the limestone banks and the pecan trees and the Texas sky, and try to hold in your mind the distance between your moment and the moment when that print was made. 95 million years. What did the ancient peoples who lived along the Paluxy think about these enormous impressions in the rock? We do not know, because the peoples who lived here in the prehistoric period left no record of their thoughts about the tracks. But we can be certain that they noticed them, that they had explanations for them, embedded in stories that encoded their understanding of the world. Giant beings, ancient spirits, the marks of creatures that had walked this earth before the current world began. In almost every culture that has encountered the fossil remains of large prehistoric animals, those remains have been incorporated into stories about giants or monsters or the creatures of an earlier world. The logic is universal. These are the marks of something that was here before us, something larger and more powerful, something that the current world can barely imagine. The ancient peoples of the Paluxy River almost certainly had such stories, and those stories are gone with them. But the tracks remain, 95 million years old, still visible in the limestone of the riverbed, still enormous, still asking to be wondered at. The coastal prairies of the Texas Gulf Coast hold another kind of ancient mystery. These are the flat, largely featureless grasslands that lie between the hill country and the coast, drained by the slow, muddy rivers that cross them to the Gulf. They are not dramatic landscapes, not the kind of terrain that announces itself as historically significant. But they were, for the ancient peoples of Texas, among the richest agricultural and foraging environments in the region. The Blackland prairies, those strips of dark, heavy clay soil that run roughly north-south through central Texas, were among the most fertile soils in North America. The grass that grew on them was tall and dense, the roots reaching deep into the moisture-retaining clay. When the rains came, the Blackland bloomed with a richness that astonished early European observers. The ancient peoples of the coastal prairies and the adjacent Blacklands were primarily hunter-gatherers, taking advantage of the bison that grazed these rich grasslands and the plant foods that grew among them. But they were also, in some areas, beginning to experiment with agriculture, growing small quantities of corn and other crops in favorable locations along the rivers. The transition from foraging to farming is one of the great themes of human prehistory, not just in Texas, but around the world. It was not a single event, not a moment of invention, but a gradual process of increasing reliance on cultivated plants alongside the continuing use of wild resources. In Texas, that transition happened at different times in different places, driven by the specific character of each region, by the availability of domesticated crop varieties. From neighboring cultures, by the population pressures and resource availabilities of each time and place. The Caddo were the most fully committed farmers in the state's ancient history. But they were not alone. Other cultures, in other parts of Texas, were moving along the same trajectory at different rates and with different emphases. And all of them were doing something that no other animal does. They were changing the landscape to fit their needs. The burning practices of the ancient Texans are perhaps the most dramatic example of this. Fire was a tool, not just for warming and cooking, though it served both those purposes. Fire was a landscape management tool. Applied to the grasslands in autumn, fire cleared away the accumulated dead grass of the previous season, stimulating new growth in spring, maintaining the grasslands in a state of productivity that they would not achieve without periodic burning. Fire drove game from cover, concentrating animals in ways that made hunting more efficient. Fire pushed back the encroachment of woody brush into the grasslands, maintaining the open landscape that bison preferred and that therefore human hunters preferred as well. The ancient Texans burned the land deliberately, systematically, with a knowledge of when to burn and where to burn, and how the land responded to burning that came from long observation and long experience. The landscape of Texas, as the first European explorers encountered it, was not a pristine wilderness untouched by human hands. It was a managed landscape, shaped over thousands of years by human burning, by human harvesting, by human movement and human presence, in ways that were invisible to people who did not know what they were. Looking at the open prairies, the absence of brush in many areas, the distribution of tree species, the productivity of the grasslands, all of it was partly the result of human management. The ancient Texans were not passive occupants of a landscape they found and used. They were active participants in the shaping of it. And the landscape they shaped was, in important ways, better than what came before. More productive, more diverse, more resilient. The wisdom that produced this management is lost. But the landscape it produced, changed though it is by subsequent history, is the landscape we inhabit today. We live, still, in the world that the ancient Texans made. The seasons in ancient Texas were more vivid than they are today, not because the climate was more extreme, though in some periods it was, but because without the technology to insulate ourselves from the seasons, without climate control and artificial lighting and the global supply chains that make every food, available in every season, the ancient Texans lived the seasons directly. In winter, they were cold. Not dangerously cold, not in most of Texas, but genuinely cold. The northern winds that blow down from the panhandle in winter can drop temperatures 40 degrees in an hour. Even in the southern part of the state, winter nights can be sharp and long. The ancient Texans huddled close to their fires in winter. They wore the robes and cloaks that their skill with animal hides could provide. They ate the stored foods of the previous autumn, the dried meat, and the processed plant materials that represented their summer's work. They told stories in the long winter evenings, the stories that were the library of their culture, rehearsed and deepened and added to through the dark months. Spring came like a physical gift. The first warmth after a long cold, the first new green on the oaks before the leaves fully opened, the first wildflowers in the hill country, the bluebonnets and the paintbrush and the wine cups that carpet the roadsides in March and April. The first migratory birds returning, their calls announcing a season that the ancient Texans, like us, associated with possibility and renewal. Spring was the season of movement, of getting up and going out, of following the plant foods northward and upward into the hills as the growing season progressed, of finding where the deer had gone through the winter and tracking them in the new grass. Summer was the season of abundance and of heat, of the long days when the work of gathering and preserving could be done in the extended light, of the rivers and the springs, more precious than ever in the heat, their cold water a luxury that the ancient Texans sought deliberately and gratefully. Autumn was the richest season. The acorn harvest, the pecan harvest along the river bottoms where the great pecan trees grew, the bison moving south into central Texas with the cooling weather, the fat of the animals built up across the summer grazing, available now for the winter. Autumn was the season of preparation, of everything being done that needed to be done before the cold returned. And then winter again. And the cycle continued, year after year, generation after generation. The same seasons, the same cycle, the same rhythm of abundance and scarcity, warmth and cold, movement and rest. You are in one of those seasons right now. Whatever season it is where you are in the middle of that ancient cycle. And the rest that comes at the end of each day, the sleep that closes each season of the year, is part of that cycle too. Part of the rhythm that the ancient Texans knew in their bodies as surely as they knew hunger and cold and warmth and satisfaction. Rest is not separate from the work. It is part of the work, the part that makes all the other parts possible. The ancient Texans understood this. They understood that the dark hours were not wasted hours, that the sleeping mind was doing its own kind of work, consolidating the experiences of the day, maintaining the health of the body, preparing for whatever tomorrow would require. And so they slept, as you are sleeping, or moving towards sleep, letting the body do what it knows how to do, letting the mind rest from the work of understanding, letting the night receive you. There is one more mystery I want to share with you before this long journey ends. It is not a mystery of ancient ruins or vanished peoples or lost languages. It is a mystery of the present moment, available to anyone who is willing to pay attention. Go to any dark place in Texas on a clear night, far enough from the cities that the sky is genuinely dark, and look up. You will see what the ancient Texans saw. Not exactly the same sky, because the positions of the stars have shifted slightly in 15,000 years due to the precession of the Earth's axis. But close enough. Close enough that the patterns you see, the shapes that the stars make against the dark, would be recognizable to a Paleo-Indian hunter camped on the Llano Estacado 10,000 years ago. The same stars, the same darkness between them, the same sensation of being very small under something very large. And in that sensation, if you sit with it long enough, something happens that is difficult to describe. The boundary between you and the sky becomes less distinct. Not in any mystical sense, not in a way that requires any particular belief, but in the simple, physical sense that the darkness inside you and the darkness outside you are made of the same darkness. That the silence inside you and the silence of the night sky are made of the same silence. And that the wonder you feel looking at those stars is made of the same stuff as the wonder the ancient Texans felt, looking at those same stars from this same earth. You are not separate from this long story. You are part of it. You are, in this moment, exactly what every human being who has ever looked up at the Texas night sky has been. A small creature made of the same material as everything around it, briefly awake in the middle of an enormous and ancient and deeply mysterious universe. Briefly awake. And now, at the end of this long night, moving towards sleep, moving toward the place where the mysteries do not press for answers, where the questions rest, where the ancient and the present meet in the quiet of a mind releasing its grip on consciousness. You have done good work tonight. You have stayed with the mystery. You have let the ancient land speak to you. Now let it hold you. The earth beneath you has been holding sleeping human bodies for 15,000 years. It knows how. It is patient and it is warm, and it has never, in all that time, let anyone fall. Let it hold you now. Feel the weight of your body releasing downward. Feel the support of whatever you are lying on. Feel your breathing slow. And slower. And slower still. The mammoths walked this earth, and they are gone, and the earth goes on. The Caddo built their mounds, and they are silent, and the earth goes on. The Jumano walked their roads, and their voices are still, and the earth goes on. The ancient painters of the lower Pecos mixed their pigments, and they are dust, and the earth goes on. And you, tonight, in this moment, are lying on this patient earth, and breathing, and resting, and the earth goes on. You are part of the going on. You are part of the ancient continuity that has never, in 15,000 years of human life in Texas, been interrupted for a single night. Every night, someone has slept on this earth. Tonight, it is you. Let that be enough. Let that be everything. Sleep. Sleep well. Sleep deep. The ancient land holds you. The ancient stars watch over you. And the long, quiet river of Texas history flows on around you, bearing you gently, carrying you forward into tomorrow and all the days that follow. Good night. Good night. Good night.